In the opening paragraph of his first autobiography, Frederick Douglass revealed a detail of his life as an enslaved person that might have surprised some of his white readers. I have no accurate knowledge of my age, never having seen any authentic record containing it. I do not remember to have ever met a slave who could tell of his birthday. In his 1845 book, Douglass dared white readers to think about the otherness of enslaved lives and the scars it had left. Even though he had escaped enslavement 7 years prior to the publication of this book, supposedly age 20, he took the seemingly mundane element of Southern slavery to show the inhumanity of enslavement and the wounds that had been inflicted upon him personally, as he described the injustice of the genre in comparison. He said, "The white children could tell their ages. I could not tell why I ought to be deprived of the same privilege." Both humiliation and aspiration, trauma and defiance speak from Douglass's words as he compared his own life as a black child in slaveholding Maryland to those of white children. In my talk, I will talk about this particular technique of comparing oneself as a tool of political discourse. The technique of becoming the agent of comparison while also being the object of it. However, instead of focusing on the vast body of pamphlets, books, and speeches Frederick Douglass has left us, I would like to invite you to think about a different part of his oeuvre. The 160 photographs that make him the most photographed American person of the 19th century. Douglass used pictures as a tool of comparison, as a mode of comparing himself to racist stereotypes of blackness on the one hand and to codes of respectability on the other. Honing in on this moment of black history in my paper, I will first explore the codes of objectivity and objecthood. Second, I will show how photographic representations in the 19th century continued images of black captivity. Finally, I will focus on Douglass's claim to authorship and his attempt to perform a political identity through the language of photography. Throughout my talk, I will argue that photography on many different levels was a way of comparing, establishing relations, and of exerting power. Before I get into 19th century photography, how 19th century photography put the question of race center stage, let me very briefly and very eclectically explore how we can think of taking and gazing at pictures as a mode of comparison. And I apologize in advance to any historians of photography and to art historians in the room, because there is so much more to say about the topic, and let's be frank, I'm out of my depth here. So, but in the context of my paper, let me briefly consider two particular aspects in the history. First, the history of objectivity and of representation in photography or in pictures. Even before the arrival of photographs, drawings and depictions in atlases or planned encyclopedia went hand in hand with modern ideas of objectivity. Among the five senses, seeing became more pronounced and a more important one. However, in these compendia, objectivity was directly connected to a truthful depiction, was not directly connected to a truthful depiction of an individual plant or animal. Rather, truth to nature meant there were composite pictures that were aimed to capture the essence of a species or of a plant. That particular task was left to the hand of scientists and artists and their subjective views of the phenomenon in front of them. To focus on the typus allowed scientists and all users to identify a particular plant by identifying commonalities through comparison. Through deduction, users could understand the rule, the typical, and thus see the individual. Given these two different sides of pictorial objectivity, the individual versus the typical, the entire discussion shifted with the arrival of mechanical photography. With the emergence of daguerreotypes and photography, especially Western scientists started to reconsider the question of objectivity and its connection to the visual. A photograph was a new kind of promise by relying seemingly on objective and disembodied technology. It allowed scientists to let nature speak for itself without the interpretation of a human being involved. Needless to say, that these kinds of expectations and hopes were subject to interpretive processes as well. As my colleague Ulfert Schörner has shown in his work on German art museums during the 19th century, it took curators years to figure out the right kind of chemical mix and to establish visual pictorial conventions that allowed for photographic objectivity. Objectivity that museums and users alike were able to decipher, finally to decipher. In any case, the comparison between the object and its depiction followed routines that had to be established and learned. They were not just a given. Objectivity has a history too, as Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison have pointed out in their groundbreaking book on the subject. Of course, there's much more to say about it and about the foundations of photography during the 19th century, but I would like to focus on one particular aspect, how photography contributed to contemporary understandings of race in America. In the context of race, visual conventions of the 19th century often established a stark contrast, and early on, during the colonial times, portrayed black people as the other, as inferior to white people. Prior to the invention of photography, in the era of early slavery, black people were often depicted as being inferior, savage, or dependent upon white people. Like in this picture of the New Amsterdam family, as servants, they were relayed to the background of paintings, as to act as silent accessories. Here is a young and dashing George Washington with a black man whom he had enslaved. Later depictions of added commentary about the assumed character and nature of black people in racist caricatures. They were portrayed in minstrel paintings as overly emotional and naive human beings. With the rise of photography, the distance of othering did not disappear, though. It became even more pronounced. While there are some photos showing black people in situations of everyday life or even enjoyment, the overwhelming majority of photographs depicted them either as enslaved or borrowing from ethnographic photography as the exotic other. Take, for instance, these two daguerreotypes that portray Renty and his daughter, Delia, taken in 1850, showing both enslaved individuals against a seemingly neutral backdrop and focusing on the profile view of their faces and their bodies. They're portrayed like scientific specimen from a distance, establishing authorship and a powerful white gaze through composition and perspective. The othering took place in and through these depictions of black people. They lay the groundwork for various modes of exclusion. Visual comparison contributed to the cultural and social power structure that allowed to exclude and to abuse them as enslaved people. By drawing a contrast between the supposedly civilized white experience and the everyday life of black people as depicted in seemingly objective pictures, photography drew a line between the two worlds and established power relations and hierarchies. In images, black people existed mainly as the exotic other or as powerless victims. Even when explicitly criticizing slavery, photographs would rarely escape that mode of exclusion, as I will show in my second example. On Independence Day, 1863, 6 months after the Emancipation Proclamation had legally freed all black people in the territories of the slaveholding southern United States, an article in Harper's Weekly introduced Gordon, a typical N, to its readers. While the article described the story of Gordon, an enslaved man who had been physically abused and chased through Louisiana swamps and bayous by enslavers and overseers, the pictures that accompanied the text became powerful icons of anti-slavery sentiment even without the backstory. Even though in Harper's Weekly they appeared as engravings, These pictures were actually based on actual photographs that had been taken in an army field, telling a story of liberation and a metamorphosis. The left image shows Gordon as he entered our lines, while the very right one shows a totally renewed Gordon in his uniform as a US soldier. The most impressive and also most infamous picture is, however, the centerpiece of this triptych, Gordon under medical inspection, showcased the gruesome and barbaric character of Southern slavery, as it focused on the scarred skin of a formerly enslaved man. While the photograph should not be conflated with the publication in Harper's Weekly, it is impossible to interpret outside of this context, which elevated it to a status of abolitionist icon. Especially in the framing of Harper's Weekly article called A Typical N, it became to represent the general experience of a black man in slavery with its excruciating torture, violence, and helplessness. The status of being a victim becomes even more prevalent through the fact that the article was more or less a composite story that combined the experience of Gordon, the man in the photo, and another enslaved man, Peter, whose story of being in captivity and on flight made for a way more compelling narrative and one that served a political agenda more clearly. Turning their backs on us, Peter/Gordon remained silent and faded into the background. Like in the pictures of plants, their individual pain and trauma got replaced by a collective, or one might say typical, experience of violence and abuse of being enslaved. Soon after its initial publication, the photograph received the name The Scourged Back, thus reducing Gordon's life to a mere metonymical device that served a northern narrative of exposing the barbarism and the moral evil of Southern slavery. So even when being critical of slavery, photographs displayed like The Scourged Back, whose authors aimed for the abolition of slavery and hope for the liberation, its liberating potential, kept individuals in visual captivity and prolonged existing narratives of black dependency. Throughout the visual narrative, Gordon Peter remained in a status of objecthood. In Harper's Weekly triptych, the man named Gordon, a typical black man, appears as an enslaved man, the victim of barbaric violence as a soldier. It created a narrative of metamorphosis and liberation, of conversion and deliverance in which each step was marked by the white gaze. Starting with enslavement, through the medical inspection by white doctors, to the enlistment of the Union Army, or in the terms of the article, Gordon as he entered our lines, Gordon under medical inspection, Gordon in his uniform as a US soldier. In this picture, Gordon remains the object of a powerful white gaze. Well, they most likely were affected by the gruesome depiction of Peter's back. The visual and the narrative conventions of the article allowed white northern readers, like the ethnographic depictions of enslaved people, to keep black people at arm's length. Both Peter and his enslavers remained the unfamiliar and the exotic other that had almost nothing to do with their own lives. However, some activists let their audience not off the hook so easily. They used the tool of comparison as a call for an empathetical approach that would draw white people in more closely. Cliffhanger. In 1845, in his first autobiography, abolitionist Frederick Douglass, whom I've quoted in the beginning, encouraged white readers to imagine themselves in similar circumstances. Even more vehemently, he continued, I say let him, white readers, be placed in this most trying situation, enslavement, the situation in which I was placed. Then, and not till then, will he fully appreciate the hardships and now how to sympathize with the toil-worn and whip-scarred fugitive slave. Douglass dared his readers to engage in a moment of comparison, comparing their own lives to the unimaginable experience of being an enslaved man. He graphically described his own scars and wounds, but left it to his readers' imagination to feel the pain and the humiliation of slavery. He encouraged white readers to empathetically use their fantasy and try to walk in his shoes. Yet beyond these words, he did not leave us any photographs like Gordon's. Like the readers in 1845, we have to imagine his scorched back. In his autobiography, Douglass made the pain he had experienced during enslavement a matter of the past. At the same time, Douglass presented himself as a new man through the medium of photography. For Douglass, who had escaped slavery at the age of 20, in 1838, photography became a mode of claiming black humanity by overcoming racist codes that were inscribed in the practice of photography. Here he challenged racist stereotypes and criticized slavery by claiming photography as an aspirational medium of visual comparison, yet in a very different manner than the scorched back. Instead of making black people the object of pictures, as a practitioner, he claimed authorship over how he appeared in photographs. And as a theoretician, he put the practice of taking and gazing at pictures at the center of racial equality. In 3 speeches given between 1861 and 1865, he addressed the medium of photography itself and how it, in his eyes, served as a marker of humanity. Douglass explained the fact that man is everywhere a picture-making animal, and even more that man is a picture-making and picture-appreciating animal. And that he defied racist ideologies that had compared black people to animals and had thus served as a reasoning for enslavement. However, for Douglass, the fact that black and white people alike could make and gaze at pictures established common ground that distinguished them from other creatures. According to Frederick Douglass, the power to make and to appreciate pictures, quote, belongs to man exclusively. Douglass' picturing became the centerpiece of the human condition, rebuking those who, quote, are just now puzzled with the question as whether the African slave should be treated as a man or as an ox, end of quote. Douglass insisted that picture making and gazing marked anthropological constants that included enslaved and black people and thus had the power for social reform and to fight racism. Not only were photographs a means to represent the world we live in, even though this mode of comparing reality and its mediated representation was highly controversial and, as I said, took some getting used to. But making pictures, and especially photography, served as a tertium comparationis and a common denominator that made it possible to compare and identify human beings. Especially the act of seeing oneself, for Douglass carried an enormous emancipatory potential, one that was directly connected to moments of comparison. Men of all conditions, he said, may see themselves as others see them. Photography enabled black people to step out of the position of being looked at. It empowered them to assure the role of comparing themselves to others. Quote, the humbled servant girl whose income is but a few shillings a week now possesses a more perfect likeness of herself than noble ladies and court royalty with all its precious treasures could purchase 50 years ago. In that, it contained a moral objectivity that went beyond claims of realistic depictions. According to Douglass, photography represented a truthfulness that went beyond what was seen in the picture. It became testimony to black people's humanity and faculties as artists and intellectuals. I quote, the process by which man is able to invert his own subject consciousness into an objective form, considered in all its range, is in truth the highest attribute of man's nature, end of quote. This power of photography went even further when it came to Douglass as the stage manager of his own image. Even though his words directly addressed the moral dimension of photographic objectivity, his own practice of picturing was even more impactful and made him a political icon of his time. For Douglass, as I mentioned earlier, the most photographed American person of the 19th century, his own photographic performances became highly staged events that confronted white viewers with their own stereotypes and expectations. When looking at Douglas's numerous pictures taken in a studio setting, they did not communicate notions of exoticism or victimhood, but of self-determination, respectability, and authority. Take, for instance, this photo that served as a frontispiece to his second autobiography. It shows Douglas in a suit looking directly at his audience, his fists clenched, in an act of dedication as a gesture of defiance and self-assurance. Knowing about the lampooning images of minstrelsy, he left us he avoided the uncontrolled emotions of a Jim Crow. Among the roughly 160 photographs he left us, only 4 contained the hint of a smile. All the others show an individual that acts in all seriousness and defied existing expectations. Douglas knew about the racist stereotypes of black people being naive and overly emotional, and he countered them through his stern look and his confident posture. The use of a particular visual repertoire was, of course, not new to Douglas. Abolitionist Olado Equiano had already used an image of him to preface his own 1789 autobiography in order to establish respectability and credibility, but the objectivity of photography carried an even greater power that Douglas was well aware of. Through his own visual politics, Douglas escaped enslavement a second time. His image was neither one of Jim Crow nor of a savage, nor of a helpless victim of enslavement. Considering the American social landscape of the mid-1800s, the confidence he showed in early photography, in his early photographs, helped build such a strong reputation that some people even questioned if he was ever a fugitive slave. By appropriating the visual codes of middle-class respectability, Douglas visually likened and compared himself to the political icons of the 19th century. Even more, such photographs were reproduced and circulated as prints in other contexts, like this carte de visite that was copied on the cover of Harper's Weekly. In his pictures, Douglas claimed a mode of representation that had been reserved for prominent politicians, and he compared himself to people like Lincoln, and he came to the conclusion that he met them on eye level. The similarity between the two pictures is striking in their use of postures and symbols of contemporary middle-class manhood and respectability. Douglas's theatrical display of seriousness and dedication became an emotional performance, a speech act, an emotive utterance. Drawing on the theories of J.L. Austin and William Reddy, I would suggest these photos performed or created a reality that did not exist before them. In that sense, Douglas's studio photographs became a performance that engaged viewers on 3 different time layers. He left the unspeakable violence of his past as an enslaved man to the viewer's imagination. Second, in the photographs, he focused on his present status as an esteemed and renowned member of the political elite, one who gave fiery speeches for the abolitionist cause and who was invited to the White House to advise the President of the United States. In that, Douglas turned upside down the visual paradox that scientists have faced. Instead of creating an image that represented an ideal type, that established rules and common features, that were to represent blackness, his individual performance in these photos broke with viewers' expectations. They rather broke a rule instead of establishing it. By turning the lens on himself, Douglas uprooted the connection between the individual and the typical and challenged the rules of typicality that racist images had established. This daring violation of black imagery allowed him to mark his own status as the author of his own image, instead of being the mere object of the white gaze. Thirdly, the resistance was in itself aspirational, as it showed the progress that Douglas had hoped for in his 1864 speech on photography. Through his speaking body, he established a promise to future generations of black people, one from which another black civil rights activist and prominent intellectual drew inspiration. In 1900, the Harvard-trained sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois compiled a body of several hundred photographs for the Paris exhibition the same year. Du Bois, at the time a professor of sociology at Atlanta University, explained that visitors of the exhibit would find several volumes of photographs seemingly typical faces of African Americans, which, and I quote him here, hardly square with conventional American ideas. His aim was plain and simple. While claiming that these photos were representative of African Americans in general, he mainly showed the diversity of black occupations and lifestyles, as well as the difference in skin tones and hair types, thus challenging American racism about the so-called type with photographic evidence of the economic, social, and cultural conditions of black people in America. He portrayed dentists, churchgoers, pharmacists, or vocational students. Du Bois' strategy differed, however, from Douglas's heroic pictures. Not only do they show moments of everyday life, but instead of turning the lens on one particular individual, Du Bois attempted to establish a type of black middle class that Europeans and Americans could relate to. Du Bois's visualization of entrepreneurs, engineers, and artists not only earned him a gold medal at the exposition, but it showed black people confidently looking at the camera, and the diversity of types and styles made it challenging for viewers to hold on to conventional expectations of what black lives looked like. Yet even in the face of black defiance and self-esteem, only 3 years later, after his success, Du Bois explained how difficult it was for black people to escape the white gaze. It is a peculiar sensation, he said, a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this way of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, end of quote. In the most famous passage from his 1903 essay, The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois aptly described a practice of forced self-comparison. In order to survive the violence of racism in America, black people in their everyday lives always had to imagine how white people would see them. In order to avoid police violence, in order to be taken seriously as entrepreneurs, in order to have their voices heard in the political arena, black people would have to compare their own views and perceptions to stereotypes and images of white America. Double consciousness. In that sense, Du Bois's photographs could be seen as an expression of black political power and independence, and as an attempt to defamiliarize white audiences in order to establish an alternative reality using the visual codes of white middle-class America. I come to my conclusion. In both his speeches and in the portraits he sat down for, Frederick Douglass acted as a visual politician through the mode of comparison. In his politics and theories, he conceptually criticized racist structures and saw photography as a way to counter stereotypes in order to overcome imaginations of the black other, of black inferiority, of black inhumanity. He challenged already existing visual codes of blackness as ethnographic specimen or as a passive victim of violent slavery. Whereas the scourged back dwelled upon the creation of sympathy or pity, sorrow and empathy, or even outrage. Whereas the depiction of these scars was meant to expose the barbarity of the Confederacy and the violence of slavery, whereas in these photographs, Gordon and Peter remained eerily silent and an object of a white gaze hidden behind the curtain of an almost scientific imagination, Douglass's photographs turned these dynamics around. Through his gaze, he sternly looked back at his contemporaries and challenged their imaginations. These depictions were highly choreographed, visual performances that were aimed to create a sense of power, awe, and respect. The enslaved man turned civil rights activist provided visual alternatives to racist and stereotyping portrayals of black men that were aspirational, confident, intellectually ambitious. After his escape from enslavement, Frederick Douglass' rebellion did not take place on the battlefield, but in the studio of photographers. In newspapers and books, that challenged white audiences, norms, and rules, expanded the range of their normality. He used the objectivity of photography to prove his own humanity and the humanity of Black people who had previously been mostly exoticized and ostracized through photography. More than 100 years after Douglas's death, that powerful connection of creating visual comparisons is still in place today when it comes to the visual reality of Black lives in America. In the wake of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, two almost identical pictures showed people wading through the floods in Louisiana, but they were compared in a very different fashions. In the captions, a Black man was described as a looter, a white couple was seen as trying to find bread instead. Black lives were criminalized, while viewers were invited to see white hardship with a more sympathetic look. Therefore, looking at Black men or women who show self-restraint, respectability, and power remains both an inspiration for Black people and a challenge to white expectations, the way Douglas had intended it, as it was in 1855, in 1919, in 1955, in 1963, or in 2011. Thank you.